Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Sunday everybody. I know I said there was likely not to be an episode this weekend, but several key developments have happened on the foreign affairs front, a front we normally cover in weekend videos. So I thought I should put out a video today so that we're on top of these as we move into next week. This is a little shorter than a weekend episode. We're just going to hit on the salient developments. Before we begin, I need to make a quick correction, however. In Friday's video, I said, quoting a source, in 2022, the number of births in China was 6.56 million. This number is incorrect. It should have been in 2022, the number of births in China was 9.56 million. My apologies for the error. Let's begin. First up, we continue with US-China relations. It's been a busy week for these developments. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi was in Washington, where he had a 3-hour meeting with US President Joe Biden on Friday. This marks the first trip to Washington by a Chinese foreign minister since 2018, the year the US-China trade war began. While the relationship is still in a very poor place, and indeed both sides believe that they are in a protracted period of acute strategic competition with each other, the theme of this meeting was seeking stabilization in relations. Beijing has 2 reasons for pursuing some stabilization. 1, the deep need to focus attention and resources onto the serious domestic challenges China faces, especially in relation to the economy, and 2, growing international concern of a US-China conflict and criticism that Beijing isn't doing enough to manage it. In his meeting with Biden, Wang Yi said that China and the United States need to return to a healthy and stable development track, and that China attaches great importance to the US and hopes to stabilize and improve bilateral relations, expressing, according to state-run Xinhua, quote, "We must act in a responsible manner toward the world, history, and the people, and follow the 3 principles of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation as proposed by President Xi Jinping to truly stabilize and improve Sino-US relations." End quote. The Biden meeting came soon after a face-to-face with US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. The One China principle, this is in relation to Taiwan, and the 3 joint communiques were, quote, "the most important political foundation for bilateral ties," end quote, according to Wang. US officials told US media that the 2 sides had agreed to work together towards an expected summit between leaders Joe Biden and Xi Jinping next month in San Francisco. During the meeting, US officials raised key concerns for Washington, namely the need to restore military-to-military channels between the 2 countries, Beijing's actions in the East and South China Seas, Taiwan, human rights, the flow of fentanyl, and the cases of Americans detained in China. US media reports that Blinken raised US concerns about China's recent actions in the South China Sea, including, quote, "dangerous and unlawful obstruction of the Philippine resupply mission to Second Thomas Shoal," end quote, a development we've been following closely in recent weeks. The Biden and Wang meeting included frank exchanges, to use Wang's language, on the conflict in the Middle East too. Washington is hoping that Beijing can use its influence with Iran to prevent an escalation of the current Gaza conflict. One US official speaking to UK-based Reuters expressed, quote, "We expressed our deep concern with the situation and pressed China to take a more constructive approach. That would include, of course, their engagements with the Iranians to urge calm." End quote. And this brings us to the next story on the foreign policy front, China's evolving response to the Middle East. As always, everyone, if you're enjoying the episode, don't forget to hit the like button. Liking, sharing, and subscribing are all big helps. And Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below for anyone who can go the extra mile and help me keep the channel financially sustainable. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Let's continue, and we move through a few key developments related to China's response to the Middle East crisis. The big news was the PRC vetoing a draft UN resolution proposed by the US this week. The PRC ambassador to the United Nations, Zhang Jun, explained Beijing's reasoning for this decision. Quote, "The draft resolution attempts to establish a new narrative on the Palestinian question, ignoring the fact that the Palestinian territory has been occupied for a long time and evading the fundamental issue of independent statehood for the Palestinian people. It is worth being vigilant that the draft departs from the spirit of previous UN resolutions and embeds the dangerous logic of clash of civilizations and the justification of war and the use of force." End quote. This very much makes it clear what Beijing's position on this region and crisis is. Regular viewers will not be particularly surprised by this language. The US draft resolution called for a humanitarian pause to enable the delivery of aid to Gaza. It also reaffirmed the, quote, "inherent right of all states," end quote, to self-defense, while fully complying with international law. Beijing was critical that it failed to call for a ceasefire and that it made no mention of Israel's military escalation, to use Beijing's language. On Thursday, a leading party mouthpiece, The People's Daily, published a special commentary on the Israeli-Palestinian crisis called "Only by ceasing fire and stopping the war as soon as possible can more severe humanitarian disasters be avoided." The piece once again unpacks Beijing's official position on the conflict and wider geopolitical considerations, writing, quote, "Only by truly implementing the two-state solution can the Israeli-Palestinian conflict be resolved," and that the internationally recognized two-state solution refers to the establishment of an independent and sovereign state of Palestine, with its borders based on those of 1967 and East Jerusalem as its capital. Following the outbreak of this round of conflict, the international community has once again profoundly realized that only by truly implementing the two-state solution can the Israeli-Palestinian conflict be resolved and true peace can be brought to the Middle East. Here ends the quote. China held its so-called 10th Symposium on China-Arab Relations and China-Arab Civilization Dialogue in the United Arab Emirates this week. China's special envoy to the Middle East, Zhai Jun, attended and made similar statements to what we just covered, but also took the opportunity to push Xi Jinping thought on diplomacy with one of its new foreign policy initiatives, the so-called Global Civilization Initiative, expressing, quote, "Against this backdrop, it is relevant for both sides to discuss topics such as strengthening exchanges between civilizations, calling for peaceful dialogue and achieving peaceful coexistence. China and Arab states are neutral partners in acting on the Global Civilization Initiative." End quote. And finally, we end today's episode, a little shorter than usual, with a quoted passage from a good piece published by the UK-based The Economist this week, called "How China Sees Gaza." This provides a good example of a Western voice explaining to English-speaking elite what China's policy on the conflict is and how it will likely use the crisis for its ongoing diplomatic and narrative struggle with the US-led West. We are now quoting the piece directly. "Politicians in America and Israel have challenged China's refusal to call Hamas a terrorist organization and its downplaying of Hamas atrocities in state media, even as graphic images of Israeli airstrikes on Gaza are reported each evening on China's main news program. In part, China's position on Hamas reflects its long-standing view that the root cause of Palestinian violence is the lack of a state. It also reflects a preference for a world order that seeks to resolve crises by balancing the interests of nation-states, rather than by making abstract appeals to universal values, which China calls a Western intervention. In effect, China treats Hamas as the political entity it would like the group to be. Least happily, the Gaza conflict is a fresh chance to depict America as a bullying warmonger. Rather than credit President Joe Biden for hugging Israel close in order to restrain it, selfish motives are assigned to him. Ul Sekur, China's former special envoy to the Middle East, is one of the countless Chinese voices to insist that Mr. Biden backs Israel because he faces an election in 2024 and fears the influence of Jewish Americans. Pondering Gaza spillover effects, Chinese scholars hail the derailing of American-brokered Israeli-Saudi talks as a heavy blow to Mr. Biden's re-election. Bashing America will not bring a wave of reconciliation to the Middle East, but China is playing a long game. Opinion polls already show publics favoring China over America in many Arab countries. Across the developing world, distrust of America is being deepened by the war. End quote. Here ends the direct quote and today's episode of China Update. I'd be very interested in hearing what your views on this final piece are and on our developments generally in the comments below. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a good weekend and I will see you all tomorrow.